Hello, everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 163 of the Movement Debrief. And today, folks, a philosopher once said, the hips don't lie, but will your pelvis. Because we're going to talk about the difference between anterior pelvic tilt and the swayback posture. They look kind of sort of similar. Is there a difference? Will we find out what we can do about maximizing the movement capabilities of each of these particular orientations? Will my camera actually stay in focus in this specific debrief? All of these questions will be answered today. Because your boy, Big Z, has got a bunch of questions that have been asked by the people. They will be answered for the people by this people right here. Fam, recognize fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The only question and first question from today comes from Anya. Here's what Anya asks. Hey, Zach, can a pelvis ever be shifted anteriorly without being tilted anteriorly? And if so, what steps would be taken to fix this, as opposed to fixing an anterior pelvic tilt? Indeed, they can. And in fact, each of these particular postures that Anya is talking about are different strategies, different movement strategies that your body may or may not be using. They lead to different movement limitations, and there's different ways that you can go about maximizing the movement capabilities if you or one of your supreme clientele has one of these. So let's break down the differences between these two postures. The postures are an anterior tilt and a swayback. Those are the two differences. The anterior tilt is where you see that deep arch in the lower back, and the swayback is where the pelvis actually translates forward. And so let's look at the differences in terms of how each of these two present from a movement perspective. First, let's talk about the anterior pelvic tilt, because I think that one is the most common. And in fact, folks, I got to preface this, it is the most common posture. There's a study that I'm going to link in the show notes. Give it a shot, check it out, because there's also going to be a corresponding blog with some pictures, all that stuff, and a podcast. If you don't want to look at me, I get it. So check that out. In this study, though, that I'm going to link, they looked at pelvic postures in normal asymptomatic subjects. All right? Now, let's talk about how prevalent each of these things are. So in this study, I think there's 120 subjects, male and female, 85% of males and 75% of females present with an anterior pelvic tilt. It's asymptomatic, folks. And that's going to be what we see with your classic anterior pelvic tilt. Now, conversely, 6% of males and 7% of females present with a posterior tilt of the pelvis, which is kind of sort of what's popping with the swayback. I'll go into details about it. So, I want to preface this because I know a lot of you wonderful, outstanding people will be tuning into my stuff, and you might think, oh, we got to do this. I must be a screwed up pooch. False. You aren't a screwed up pooch, folks, because these predispositions, these postures are normal. They're common findings. Look at how common both of those findings are. And having an anterior tilt, having a swayback, isn't inherently bad unto itself. And we can't say, we at least don't have evidence to support that these are causing all of the problems in your lives. So again, as I know you're watching this right now, you're probably skipping over this, but I'll say it one more time. Having an anterior pelvic tilt or having a posterior tilt of the pelvis does not equate always with pain. It is a normal, common finding. One more time. Anterior tilt in 75% of the population. Posterior tilt, 6 to 8%. Asymptomatic people, what you going to do about it? That's it. If you have movement limitations that correspond with that, then things can be problematic. And so we're going to dive into what that might look like. First, the anterior tilt. So if I anteriorly tilt the pelvis or orient the pelvis, what happens is tissues on the upper part of the pelvis, if we use kind of the greater trochanter as our marker, these would be tissues above the greater trochanter. So think piriformis, obturator internus, or the posterior glute med, upper glute max, etc., etc. Those muscles, for whatever reason, again, we can't preface as to why, but it's likely based on genetics and structure and how your body has to manage the forces that it deals with, that's going to push the pelvis forward like so. And when that forward push happens, you'll see that the pubic symphysis kind of orients downward, like that. And when that happens, there will be some corresponding changes movement-wise if this downward or anterior orientation is all that you have. So for example, if I'm more predisposed to being more anterior and I have a difficult time or an inability to go posterior, well, that might lead to some potential movement limitations. What are those movement limitations? Well, I'm glad you asked. If you look at, as I anteriorly orient the pelvis or tilt it forward, you'll notice that the acetabulum, so the hole that your femur sits in, well, folks, as I anteriorly orient or tilt, that's going to point more inward, like that. And when it points inward, that is internal rotation. And so based on the orientation that happens at the acetabulum, with someone who has an anterior pelvic tilt, that tilt will allow for an increase in relative internal rotation at the femur. Don't believe me? I'll show you how you can make that happen to yourself real quick. We're going to use the thorax as a reference point for this. So here's what I want you to do. Go ahead, try this at home. You're going to take your arm, and you're going to put it out to your side, just like I am right here. So I got about 90 degrees of abduction. Looks like I'm about to punch the camera, but don't worry, I won't. I'm a lover, not a fighter. So when I am in this position, what I want you to do is go ahead and internally rotate your humerus, and you're going to be able to do that a certain amount. Now I'm going to show you how you can pick up internal rotation way quick without having to do any breathing exercises or anything. You ready for it? So IR your humerus, and then I want you to go ahead and just anteriorly tilt your thorax. So go ahead and down the pump handle and watch what happens. Ready? Boom. Holy cow, folks. Did I just pick up about 30 degrees of internal rotation from anteriorly tilting my thorax? Why, yes, I did. But I didn't. All I did was change the orientation of this case of my thorax, which altered the glenoid orientation to give me the appearance that there's more internal rotation. Conversely, if I externally rotate my humerus and I do the same thing, anteriorly tilt the thorax, crap. You can see that it looks like I ran out of ER. But did I? What likely happened was I just changed the orientation of my thorax, which caused an alteration in the amount of humeral motion available. That same principle, folks, applies to your pelvis. If I anteriorly orient or tilt the pelvis, the acetabular position is going to change to where you will have more available internal rotation and less available external rotation. How do you know if this is an orientation issue or if it's something that's more related to structure like infrasternal angle or infrapubic angle? If the total arc of motion, ER and IR, is less than 100 degrees, you're likely dealing with an orientation issue. And the reason why I say that is because orientations theoretically will happen if you cannot pick up the relative motion that's needed at the femur or at the hip joint because of whatever. There's a loss of dynamics that cause a limitation at the hip joint itself. And so what will happen is your body will change its orientation to try to pick up that available motion. So if you see a drop-off of total arc of rotation less than 100 degrees from ER to IR, because normally, our average is 60 degrees ER and 40 degrees IR, then you're likely dealing with an orientation issue. There will be a magnification of internal rotation and a drop-off of external rotation with someone who has an anterior tilt of the pelvis that has an inability to reverse that. Other things that you might find as a testing piece would be if the anterior orientation is significant enough that it creates a eccentric or stretched or long position of hamstrings and things like that. You may also see a magnification of the straight leg raise. It might be significantly more. You might also see a toe touch that's very big where someone has the ability to palm the floor. But it's not always the case because someone might only have a slight anterior orientation where it gives them a little bit more IR and external rotation drops off. And then you might not have it so far drop off that it allows that magnification of the straight leg raise. And so that's what's going on with an anterior tilt of the pelvis. Let me recap for you wonderful folks real quick. Anterior tilt orients the acetabulum towards an internally rotated position. This allows you to pick up internal rotation, so you might have more internal rotation come up. You'll likely have less external rotation available. The total arc of 100 degrees of rotation that should be present in the hip joint will be reduced. That's when you know you have an anterior tilt that has a deficit in available movement options, and you might need to do things to address it. What will we do to address it? Stay tuned. In fact, folks, a lot of the things that we will address for this are present in my seminar, Human Matrix. If you want to check it out, I do have one in Charlotte, North Carolina next weekend, November 6th and 7th. The last one for 2021 is December 4th and 5th in Las Vegas, Nevada. That's going to be off the heezy, so definitely check that out. And then, folks, I do have a couple that have opened up in 2022, May 7th and 8th in Buffalo, New York, and August 6th and 7th in Boston, Massachusetts. More to come. Let's now talk about that Swayback. You know what I'm talking about, the Fat Joe lean back. Lean back. That's what I'm talking about. What will happen here is instead of stuff above the trochanter tipping the pubic symphysis downward, you'll have muscles that are below the greater trochanter, so greater trochanter is here, right below, that are pushing the pelvis, and they'll tip it somewhat posterior, but also push it forward because these muscles also create external rotation at the femur. And so the combination of those muscles kicking in will cause a forward translation of the pelvis to some degree. In folks who have significant muscular activity on the back side, so your glute grippers, things like that, they might have a severe amount of forward translation. How do we know it's severe? There's a drop-off of movement limitations. That's the key. Because remember, it's posterior tilting's normal. With that, we got below trochanteric muscles, posteriorly tilting and pushing forward. What is this person going to look like from a testing perspective so we know, hey, this might be something that we got to deal with? Here's what it is. Well, if I'm pushed forward and I'm externally rotating a significant amount, it would reason to believe, folks, that we'll have a drop-off of internal rotation because these muscles are external rotators. And so you'll see a loss of internal rotation. You may also, again, see a drop-off of the total arc of rotation as well in this particular situation. With that in mind, we might also see limitations in hip flexion and the straight leg raise. And the reason why is because these muscles attach on the lower portion of the pelvis and the femur. And so your hamstrings also could potentially be here as well. And if there's enough concentric activity, well, with hip flexion, because they're pulling so much into ER, you might not even be able to get them adequately in the test position because I have to have some semblance of IR at the start just to center the hip into flexion. Do you see that? So like, you know how most people, when they lie flat, their toes or their legs splay out? Well, you got to splay them in, which is femoral IR. Well, if the restriction is severe enough, you might not be able to do that. And so you might see a drop-off of early hip flexion or early straight leg raise. Toe touch, probably going to be LOL status. It won't be there. So with someone who's got the sway back posture where the pelvis is pushing forward from the bottom below the trochanter, drop off of internal rotation, you'll likely see a limitation in hip flexion, straight leg raise, and toe touch won't be there. Hip external rotation could, at 90, could be magnified. There could be a lot, but again, you also have to think about in this particular situation, well, when I bring it to 90 degrees, I've probably had to pick up motion elsewhere to get there. Because if someone has a limitation in the straight leg raise or hip flexion, and then you bring them beyond that limitation, other bones likely have to move to accommodate. And a lot of times that can be the lower back. When that happens, what will occur if I have that slight posterior tilt or I have a posterior orientation that comes from the lumbar spine, just like with the anterior pelvic tilt, we had the acetabulum orient inward. Well, when I create a relative posterior tilt, that's going to cause the acetabulum to orient outwards, which is external rotation. That's why the external rotation measure might be magnified with this particular presentation. So the big key with each of these postures is anterior orientation, more internal rotation, less external rotation, sway back / posterior tilt / pelvis going forward / yeesh, glute gripping. They're going to have more external rotation, but a drop off of internal rotation. And that's the difference between those two. Given that we have a drop off between these measures and they're different with each particular presentation, well, probably makes sense that we would probably go about it differently to improve the movement capabilities of each of these individuals. I think so. And in fact, I'm going to talk to you about what we would do for each of those peeps. First, let's go into improving an anterior pelvic tilt. Here's what we know. Pelvis is in that downwardly facing position. Femurs are IRing. General rule of thumb. You want to try to teach your supreme clientele, in this case, to go in the opposing direction. So the opposing direction, so I can restore kind of the full movement repertoire for these peeps, is going to be posterior tilt and external rotation. Gosh, that sounds familiar. What is that? Folks, that's the stack. Talk to me, baby. That is the stack. We want to teach these peeps to stack, but we can't just do it in any one position. These wonderful people who have an anterior tilt or orientation have a drop-off of external rotation-based measures. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to choose a position that allows them to pick up external rotation. The position that I like to go with in the beginning is in that 0 to 60 range, because when I'm at 0 to 60 degrees of hip flexion, that's going to get me more external rotation. Two moves you can use would be a hook line tilt progression. Don't worry, it's going to be in the show notes. The other one that you could use would be a high depth squat. The wall squat works pretty swimmingly here. Those would be my two starting points for these folks. Your terminal thing that you want to be able to get them to go through is a fuller depth squat. Because when they do the squat, what they're going to end up doing is arching their back and shooting the hips posterior. What we want instead is we want them to get the stack, so pelvis tucked underneath them, full exhale to rib cage, and we want to create vertical pelvic displacement. The hook line tilt and the wall squat are going to help with that. But if you can get them to do something where they can go lower and maintain that position when they squat, whoo, they're going to be moving like rock stars, folks. Zercher squat is a really good way of getting that. You can also use a box and a ramp to help grade how low you need to go. So for someone with an anterior orientation, stacking is the way you want to attack movement restrictions for this particular person. Anterior tilt, pretty straightforward. Stuff we've been typically doing, a lot of stuff that we've been talking on the debrief and this site. What about the sway back? These folks are a little tougher. The reason why I say they're tougher is because, most of the muscles that you're kicking in when you're coaching the stack are on the back side. They're going to be glutes, hamstrings, lower stuff below the trochanter. Ooh, but folks, last time I checked, this stuff was like a toiga on these peeps. So what do? Well, guess that breathing stuff don't work, right? False. You just have to go about it a different route. You need to choose activities that reduce the muscular tension and the concentric positioning or orientation of muscles below the trochanter. A lot of times with people who have more of a swayback posture, they generally have more movement restrictions in comparison to someone who has the anterior tilt. And so what you want to do, if they have multi-directional restrictions, they might have a drop-off of external rotation. And we saw that with the loss of the straight leg raise and hip flexion. You might have to do activities that teach them to move with a lot less tension. And I've had a lot of success doing various rolling exercises to go with this. And so if you've checked out my channel, the lower body roll, the foam roller lower body roll is a good second starting point. The reason why I would say that is because there is a greater rotational element about it. And they might have a hard time with that because it does require more motion. But you're moving slow, controlled, your nasal breathing throughout. You want to create as little tension as possible. You could do a similar roll with a bilateral position where your legs are atop one another. That would be a little easier. And it's not like a hip shifting exercise, but what you want to think about is you're turning the sacrum back and forth, or you could use the pubic symphysis as your marker to turn it back and forth. Both of those work pretty well in the beginning because what you're doing is you're teaching them to move their hips without squeezing the cheeks so hard like they just had a big bender at Chipotle. We don't want that. So we have to teach them to move their pelvis with a whole lot less tension. Rolling is immensely useful for that. You just want to make sure it's slow, controlled, very low effort, like 1 to 2 out of 10 effort. Once you've done that, and you're able to get them to move a little bit with not creating a whole lot of tension, your next step that you want to go after is doing things that's going to create an eccentric position of stuff that's below the trochanter. Toe touch progressions are really good here. I would strongly encourage messing with the heels elevated calcaneal toe touch. That's the one where you got heel elevation, you're relaxing in the position, and you're just gently driving the movement through your feet and with breathing. That would be the next thing that I would go after. How do you know when to go after that? You start seeing your straight leg raise and your hip flexion improve slightly. You might actually see some nice changes in hip rotation. If you got like one of these peeps and they got 20 degrees straight leg raise and it gets to like 40, 45, or even a little bit more, that's when I would probably start going into the toe touch side of things. To summarize this amazing question from Anya, anterior tilt, stuff above the trochanter pushes downward. You're going to have a drop-off of external rotation. You might see an increase in internal rotation. The fix for that is to stack. You want to get them to tuck their hips. I would choose 0 to 60 degrees of hip flexion to do that. Someone who has a swayback posture, which is a little bit more of a posterior tilt and a forward translation, they have concentric activity of muscles below the greater trochanter that cause the posterior tip and the forward push. They're going to have a drop-off of internal rotation-based measures, and they're going to be really tight on the backside. You might even see like the hollow glutes, your butt grippers. Then you got to slow cook the brisket a little bit. You got to get them to move really, really slow at the pelvis without creating that posterior tension. Rolling is useful. And then you want to progress towards toe touch activities to really expand the range of motion. And after you've done those two things, you can probably get them back on your stacking program and no one will mess with you. Unbelievable question, Anya. Michaela has a great follow-up question. What role does the rectus play in swayback posture? Are those people upper ab grippers, rectus dominant? Yes, they are. When you do the swayback posture, as your hips go forward, your upper body is trying to counteract that forward push and not fall back. So what will happen is rectus, or the pump handle, is going to go even more down. So it's not uncommon with a swayback posture to see someone have a significant pooch belly. And so if you have all this rectus damn near Achilles activity, and let's say you got a bunch, or it's not cleared up completely after some of the rolling activities, which you could do upper body rolls for this, you might consider doing things to improve pump handle expansion. This is where something like quad on elbows based stuff could work well, or even prone on elbows. Because what's nice about that is you're going to have gravity pushing air and the viscera downward. That's going to help create an eccentric position of both the anterior thorax and the ab wall. Because if rectus damn near Achilles abdominis is kicking in to a high degree, you might have a hard time really getting the tuck. And that's going to impact your ability to stack. You're not going to be able to talk to me. And they're going to be sad. So after you've done rolling, and especially if you try the toe touch stuff and you see them just anteriorly tilt the thorax, you might need to do some focal work to get the rectus damn near Achilles to chill. Go after anterior expansion in that case. Ian. Hey, Big Z. Swayback, palm on the floor. Are those just long hamstrings or a spine flexion rectus abdominis strategy? How would you differentiate if it's one or the other? If you do have someone who has a sway back posture that palms the floor, well, we got to think about what happens with a toe touch. With a toe touch, I have to create a full bend through the entire spine. So I need posterior expansion just about everywhere. I need counter nutation of the sacrum at the start, but then at the tail end, I am going to create a little bit of nutation to create a posterior weight shift. The last thing that needs to happen is muscles below the trochanter need to eccentrically elongate so you can go all the way down. Now here's the issue. If I have someone with a swayback posture, you got two things going on. Well, one, they likely don't have dynamics in the pelvis. We're assuming that they have movement restrictions here. The second thing is that they're concentric at stuff below the trochanter. So these options that are needed to perform a full toe touch are not there. So if that's true, you have to find the range of motion elsewhere. Chances are that's going to be at the lumbar spine or somewhere on the spine where they'll create that bend. So they might be the person who bends at one segment significantly through the lumbar spine or somewhere in the lower thoracic. And that's likely how that type of individual could elicit a toe touch. The other thing that they might do is they might ER the feet enough that allows them to buy a little bit more room in the like sacral area. So that would be likely how that would happen. Michaela, do you suggest using a towel roll in the low back when working with a sway back in the supine position? How would you go about making them feel hamstrings without glute clenching? You got to delay stacking based stuff. You have to make sure that they're able to move their pelvis without generating tension, and you have to be able to create an eccentric position of muscles below the trochanter. And you might have to do some of the stuff we talked about to get rectus to chill and promote anterior expansion. After you've done that, you actually might use the side lying position to create some of the tucking based activities, or you do it asymmetrically in the supine position. The reason why I say that is because generally people with a sway back posture are more restricted in many directions. If they're restricted in many directions, side lying position can promote A to P expansion, which we need. You could also get some rotational action, which is again going to get you anterior and posterior expansion by doing something single leg-ish in hook lying or offset or anything like that. And then when you're coaching, you just got to go slow. Use the similar mindset that we had with a lot of the rolling activities. It's slow, controlled, it's chilling. You can put, that person put their hands on their abdomen as a reference to make sure that rectus damn near Achilles stays relatively relaxed. That's what I would do. Arda, sway back, hyperextension of the knee on the right side, foot supination on the right side. What does that tell you? How to get them to engage calf muscles. So if you think about this, Arda, if I am pushing the pelvis way forward and I keep the foot on the ground, watch what happens at the knee. You ready? So I'm going to push the pelvis forward. You can't see it. It's off camera. Boom. You see how my knee hyperextended there? So the degree that you push forward And if that person wants to try to bring the center of mass back, they might do that by hyperextending through the knees, because that's where they're getting the posterior expansion. Because when I hyperextend the knee, you can just see, if you zoom into the knee joint, how I create more space on the back side, because I can't create the space on this back side, which is your back side, aka the booty. And so what you got to do with those peeps is soft knees, teach them to bring the center of mass back elsewhere. Great question. I think that's a good stopping point for us today. I want to thank all of you amazing folks for tuning in. And again, folks, if you want to learn more, check me out on ZachCouples.com. And we actually address both of these postures at Human Matrix, my seminar, which we've had basically almost like the last one sold out. The first one was darn near close to selling out. We had about 30 people at them, and we got a few more of them coming this year, folks. I would strongly encourage you to attend, because it's one thing to learn it. It's another thing to coach it and actually practice it. And there was this really cool, one of the people who attended, who's a movement expert, was getting cooked on a lot of easy moves. And so if you coach stuff extremely well, which you'll learn how to do in this seminar, you're going to get so much more out of these activities. So check it out. The next one is next week, November 6th and 7th in Charlotte, North Carolina. We still have some tickets available, so I'd love to see you there. We also got December 4th and 5th at the Home Crowd Elevate Sports Performance and Healthcare in Las Vegas, Nevada. That one's going to be off the heezy. You'll definitely want to go to that one. And then next year, I got May 7th and 8th in Buffalo, New York, August 6th and 7th in Boston, Massachusetts. And it's not up on the website yet, but it will be. May 28th and 29th is going to be in Seattle, Tacoma. So that's what we got going on. I'm going to try to get more available. And Brad, I'm glad you're going to be at the one in Vegas. So cool. So please attend. Would love to see you there. Give it a shot. You won't regret it. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been an amazing, outstanding audience. And I hope that you keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving. And I'll see you next time. Deuces.